She was younger than I expected, barely out of her teens, her hair plastered to her forehead with rain, her arms tightened around. Before I tell you about the night I carried that child, I need you to understand the kind of dust that clung to everything in that borderland. It was a fine gray grit that settled in the folds of your uniform and never quite came off, no matter how often you beat it against a rock. Even the moonlight looked pale and dry when it passed through that dust. It was the summer of 1982 and I was 24, serving as a field medic with a small peacekeeping unit stationed along a disputed line between two nameless hills. We weren't there to fight so much as to keep the wounded alive long enough to get them back to the Valley Hospital. Most of us were barely older than the rifles we carried, though I carried more bandages than bullets. Our camp sat in a shallow ravine beside a narrow riverbed that went dry most of the day and came alive only when the mountain storms let loose. By late afternoon that day, the wind carried the smell of coming rain, even though the sky was still hard blue. I'd spent most of my shift changing dressings for 3 local shepherds caught in crossfire the night before. Their families had followed them into camp, waiting with quiet, watchful eyes as we worked. The older sergeant, a man called Heller, told me to pack an emergency kit to take on patrol. "You'll go with Corporal Diaz to the ridge tonight," he said, rubbing the bridge of his nose as if the thought gave him a headache. "Reports say there's movement near the river crossing. Might be refugees, might be scavengers. Either way, we keep them safe if we can." I slung my kit over my shoulder as the sun sank behind the western hills, turning the sky the color of rusted iron. Diaz met me at the edge of camp, adjusting the strap of his carbine. He had a steady way of speaking that made even bad orders sound reasonable. "You stick to me and keep your head low," he said. "I'll do the looking. You do the patching if it comes to it." We started up the narrow ridge trail as the first fingers of twilight slid into the gullies. The path was littered with loose stones that shifted under our boots, and every scrape of rock against rock echoed louder than it should have. Below us, the dry riverbed caught what little moonlight there was and gleamed like a strip of dull tin in the darkness. Halfway up the trail, a gust of cool air drifted past, carrying the smell of rain and wood smoke. Somewhere ahead, across the unseen line that divided one side from the other, a dog barked once, and then went quiet. Diaz slowed his pace and crouched low. He pointed to a cluster of thorn bushes near the bend. "Tracks," he whispered. I knelt beside him, shining my small flashlight only long enough to see the faint prints pressed into the dust. Smaller than a soldier's boot, wider apart than a goat's. "Refugee?" I asked. "Could be," he said. "Could be somebody moving supplies. Let's keep going." By the time we reached the ridgetop, night had fallen fully. Clouds had gathered without warning, blotting out the stars, and the first low rumbles of thunder rolled across the valley. We crouched in the lee of a boulder to wait out the wind and watch the river crossing below. The lantern at the far guard post on our side swung in the gusts, its glow sometimes hidden by the rain curtain that began to drift across the valley. For a long while, we saw nothing but the shifting shadows of brush and trees bending in the wind. I began to think we'd be heading back empty-handed when Diaz stiffened beside me. He pointed down toward the riverbed. Through the curtain of light rain, I saw a flicker of pale cloth moving against the dark stones. Someone small and slight stumbling along the shallows. I couldn't make out more than the shape, but even at that distance I felt the strange certainty that whoever it was carried something in their arms. Diaz muttered, "That's no scout. Looks like a villager." We watched as the figure slipped on the wet stones and fell to one knee, then rose again, clutching the bundle tight to their chest. The river wasn't deep yet, but the current was quickening with the runoff from the first storm water. I felt my hand tighten on the strap of my kit. Something in the way the figure moved, unsteady but determined, told me this was no smuggler's run. Whoever they were carrying more than just themselves across that border. I didn't know yet that inside that bundle was a child from the other side of the conflict, or that before dawn I would be carrying that child myself through the rain and mud, trying to keep a spark of life alive where bullets had failed. Diaz tapped my arm and motioned for us to move down the slope. The drizzle had turned into a steady rain, soaking our jackets until they clung to our shoulders. The rocky path was slick, and every step sent loose gravel sliding ahead of us. We kept low, using the thorn bushes and the big basalt stones for cover. Even though the figure we had seen looked like no soldier, we couldn't be sure who else might be watching the crossing that night. The border was quiet most days, but the wrong night could turn a peaceful stretch of river into a line of fire. Halfway down the slope, lightning flashed over the eastern ridge, showing us the river for a heartbeat, a winding silver snake now swollen by rain. When the darkness closed in again, the sound of water rushing over stones seemed louder, as if the storm had brought the river to life. The figure in the shallows had reached the near bank but struggled to climb the muddy incline. We could see now that the bundle in their arms was wrapped in a pale wool blanket, its edges darkened by rain. The person, likely a young woman by her slight build, slipped again, falling to one knee in the mud before pulling herself up. Diaz called out softly in the local tongue, a cautious greeting meant to calm more than alarm. The woman turned her head toward us, wide-eyed but silent. I raised both hands to show I carried no weapon, then slung the medical kit forward to make its red cross visible in the lantern's dim light. Another flash of lightning lit her face. She was younger than I expected, barely out of her teens, her hair plastered to her forehead with rain. Her arms tightened around the bundle as if to shield it from the storm, though the blanket was already soaked through. We reached the river's edge at the same time she tried to climb the bank again. Diaz offered his free hand. She hesitated, then let him help her up. Once on firmer ground, she shifted the bundle enough for me to glimpse a small, pale face peeking from the folds. A child, no older than 2, limp with exhaustion. The woman spoke at last, her voice low and hoarse. She pointed back across the river and said a few words we barely understood, but the meaning was clear enough. The child was sick, fevered, and they had been walking since dusk to reach safety on our side. I knelt in the mud, unzipping my kit under the lantern's trembling light. The child's skin was hot to the touch, far too hot for a rainy night. I had little more than a field thermometer, some antiseptic wipes, and a vial of fever reducer, but I knew we had to get them to the camp's medic tent before the fever climbed higher. Thunder cracked so close it rattled the stones around us. The rain grew heavier, drumming on the river and raising a mist that blurred the far bank from sight. Diaz glanced upriver where the water churned around a pile of storm-felled branches and muttered that the crossing would be impossible if the current rose any higher. I told the woman we had to move quickly. She nodded, though her eyes stayed fixed on the child's face as if willing the small chest to keep rising and falling. We started up the muddy incline toward the ridge trail. Diaz led the way, scanning the dark slopes for movement. I followed close behind the woman, keeping one hand near the child's head to shield it from the rain and the low branches that clawed at us along the path. Halfway up the hill, the trail narrowed where a rock slide had once carved a shallow notch into the slope. The woman stumbled there, her boots sinking ankle-deep in the slick clay. Without thinking, I slid the kit to my back and reached for her arms. "I'll carry the child," I said. She hesitated, reluctant to let go even for a moment, but then loosened her hold and let me lift the small, blanketed form. The child felt light as a bundle of rags, yet burned with the heat of fever against my chest. I adjusted my grip to keep the head cradled under my chin, then steadied the mother with my free hand as we climbed. The rain showed no mercy, and by the time we reached the ridgetop, the 3 of us were soaked to the bone. The lantern Diaz carried threw a faint circle of gold onto the wet stones, barely enough to guide our steps back toward the camp. Looking down at the child's face in that shifting glow, I saw the eyes half open, staring without focus. A soft cough rattled in the small chest, muffled by the blanket. I whispered a promise the child could not hear. Almost there, just a little longer. That night, every step I took was measured not by distance, but by the fragile rise and fall I felt against my chest. The weight of a life that had nothing to do with borders or uniforms. The rain eased for a short while as we began the descent from the ridge toward camp. The air smelled of wet clay and pine needles, fresh yet heavy, as though the storm had pressed the mountain's scent into the earth. Far below, the camp's lanterns flickered like tiny embers against the dark slope. Diaz walked ahead, keeping his rifle slung but ready. His boots slid now and then on the mud, leaving streaks behind him that quickly filled with rainwater. The young woman followed close at my side, her arms folded across her chest for warmth, her wet hair plastered to her cheeks. She didn't speak, just watched the bundle in my arms as if her gaze alone could keep the child's breath steady. I kept my ears open for anything that didn't belong, The sharp snap of a twig, the low click of shifting stones, because the silence after a storm often hides footsteps. A few times I thought I heard something behind us, but it was only the drip of rainwater falling from the overhanging rocks. When the clouds thinned and let a pale moon break through, the path shone slick and silver. I could finally see the child's face more clearly. Round cheeks, chapped lips, a faint shadow under the eyes where fever had settled like bruises. Each rise and fall of the small chest against my jacket reassured me we were still in time. Halfway down the slope, Diaz raised his fist, a silent signal to halt. He crouched low, scanning the dark stand of pines that grew at the edge of the path. I listened too and caught a faint rustle. Not the wind, but the dragging step of someone moving slowly over wet leaves. Diaz called out in the local tongue, the same word he had used before. "Friend?" A figure stepped out from behind a pine trunk, hands raised to show they carried no weapon. It was a man, gaunt, rain-soaked, and limping on one leg. Even in the poor light, I could see a strip of cloth tied crudely around his calf, dark with fresh blood. The woman gasped softly and murmured something that sounded like a name. The man answered her with a short phrase, relief breaking across his tired face. Diaz lowered his rifle a little but kept it ready. He asked the man if there were others. The reply came haltingly. 2 more villagers farther upriver who had turned back when the current rose. I wanted to stop to tend to his wound right there, but Diaz shook his head. "We need to get them all under cover first," he said. "We'll send a patrol for the others at first light." We helped the man down the slope, moving as fast as his limp allowed. The woman stayed near him now, her free hand sometimes brushing his elbow for balance. I shifted the child higher against my chest, feeling the heat of the fever radiate even through the wet blanket. The path widened as we neared the lower ridge, opening to the muddy stretch that led straight into camp. I caught sight of Sergeant Heller's lantern bobbing near the gate. He had come out to meet us, probably drawn by the sound of distant thunder and the absence of our patrol. When we stepped into the circle of light cast by the gate lantern, Heller's brows knitted at the sight of the villagers. He was a man hardened by too many years at posts like this, but his voice softened when he saw the child in my arms. "Medic tent," he ordered, pointing toward the far corner of the camp. Diaz led the limping man inside while I carried the child straight to the small canvas tent where we kept our supplies. The warmth of the lanterns inside was a sharp contrast to the chill rain outside. I laid the child gently on a folded blanket and checked for a pulse. The heartbeat fluttered weakly but held on. The young mother knelt beside me, watching as I worked. I dried the child's face with a clean cloth and wrapped him in a dry army blanket, then gave him a measured dose of the fever reducer. The boy stirred faintly and made a small sound that was neither cry nor cough, just a tired sigh that somehow eased the knot in my chest. When I finally looked up, the woman was whispering words of thanks I couldn't understand but felt in the way her shoulders relaxed. Outside the tent, the rain began again in gentle sheets, tapping on the canvas roof like patient fingers. The sound mingled with the low murmur of voices from the gate as Heller questioned Diaz about the night's encounter. That was the first time I realized the war's lines were blurred by the river's flood and the mountain's storm. Inside that tent there was no enemy, only a sick child, 2 weary villagers, and a medic trying to keep a fragile spark alive until morning. The canvas walls of the medic tent glowed faintly with the lantern's yellow light, soft enough to make the place feel warmer than it really was. I knelt beside the boy as the storm's wind rattled the ropes outside, testing each knot as if the rain wanted in. The child's breathing was shallow but more regular than when we had carried him in. A damp curl of hair stuck to his temple and his cheeks were flushed with the heat of the fever. I checked his pulse again, counting the beats while listening to the muffled thunder rolling off the distant hills. The young mother sat cross-legged near the cot, her wet skirt clinging to her knees. Every few minutes she reached out to smooth the blanket over the boy's shoulders, then pulled her hand back as though afraid she might disturb him. She didn't speak, only hummed a tune so low I felt it more than heard it, like a lullaby for herself as much as for the child. Diaz entered quietly, shaking rain from his jacket and leaving a dark trail on the floor. He nodded toward the boy. "How's he holding?" he asked. "Still warm, but stable for now," I answered. "If we can keep his fever down till morning, we can move him to the valley clinic." Diaz crouched by the tent flap and rubbed his hands together for warmth. He looked as tired as I felt, eyes rimmed red from rain and sleeplessness. "Heller's posted extra watch," he said. "Wants us ready in case someone comes looking for the villagers. Says the river's still rising." I nodded, adjusting the folded blanket under the boy's head. The lantern's flame flickered when a gust of wind pressed against the canvas, throwing quick shadows across the walls. Shapes that made the small tent feel momentarily crowded, as though more people watched over us than were actually there. For a while, the only sounds were the patter of rain, the lullaby hum, and the steady rasp of the boy's breathing. I wiped his forehead with a damp cloth dipped in cool water, then checked his lips for dryness. The fever had softened his features, making him look younger than his few years. Diaz broke the silence. "You ever think about why we end up here?" he asked, his voice just above a whisper. "Not the army. This border, these hills. Nights like this." I glanced at him, unsure how to answer. "I signed up to save lives," I said finally. "I didn't ask whose side they'd be on." He gave a short nod that held no judgment, only understanding. "That's a good enough reason," he murmured, then leaned back against a wooden supply crate and closed his eyes. The boy stirred at one point, a weak whimper escaping his throat. I placed a hand on his chest to calm him and spoke softly in my own tongue. Words he likely couldn't understand, but that I hoped he could feel. "Easy now. You're safe tonight." The mother watched my face as I spoke, her eyes searching mine as though to gauge if I truly believed what I said. After a moment, her shoulders eased slightly and she rested her head against the tent pole behind her. Around midnight, the storm slackened to a slow drizzle, and the tent felt almost still. I let myself sit back on my heels, stretching a cramp out of my legs. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and wet canvas, oddly comforting after the damp scent of the river. I thought of home then, of my own mother sitting by a window when I was sick as a boy, keeping a cool cloth by my bed. That memory stayed with me as I watched this young mother keep her vigil. And for the first time that night, I felt something close to hope that the child would make it through till dawn. Just before I drifted into a light doze, Diaz stirred again, muttering half awake. "Storm's moving east. Maybe we'll get some quiet now." I didn't answer. The quiet we had in that moment was enough. The soft rain, the lantern's gentle glow, the faint rhythm of a child's breathing steadying in the night. By dawn, the river had calmed to a swollen, slow-moving mass that hissed over the mudflats and lapped against the roots of the cottonwoods. The rain stopped sometime before sunrise, leaving the hills wrapped in a low mist that smelled of wet clay and pine. We had slept in snatches, heads resting against our packs, but no one felt rested. The boy's fever had broken in the early hours, and when I checked his pulse again, it was stronger. His chest rose and fell in a steadier rhythm, though each breath still wheezed faintly as it left him. The young mother sat awake beside him, eyes rimmed red but dry now. She whispered something in her own language as she laid a palm over the boy's hair. Outside the tent, the camp had already stirred to life. Men moved with quiet purpose, gathering ropes and inspecting the footbridge that had washed out overnight. The river had carved a new channel around the base of the old crossing, tearing up planks and twisting the rope railing like twine. If we were going to carry the child to the valley clinic, we'd have to find another way across. Heller paced along the riverbank, scanning for any stretch shallow enough to wade. Diaz joined him, both men crouching now and then to prod the mud with sticks, testing the ground for firmness. The water was deceptively calm, mud brown on the surface but likely fast beneath. I stepped out of the tent to breathe the cool morning air. The mist carried the scent of wet earth and charred wood from the campfires, a strangely peaceful smell after the night's storm. Heller noticed me and waved me over. "We've scouted upstream," he said. "Found a sandbar near the bend. Might be shallow enough if we make a human chain. You'll have to cross first with Diaz to test it." I nodded. My boots sank an inch into the soft bank as I followed him to the bend. There the river widened, the current spreading thinner but no less eager. Branches and bits of reed drifted past like scouts sent downstream. Diaz slung the rope coil from his shoulder and tied one end to a tree trunk. We waded in slow, the cold biting instantly up to our knees, then thighs. The bottom was soft, but held under our weight. By the time we reached the sandbar midway, the water pressed against our hips with a steady push that threatened to shift our footing. We strung the rope across as a handhold, knotting it around a drift-jammed stump on the far side. Heller signaled the others to form a chain behind us, boots planted wide, fingers gripping the rope in each other's sleeves. When the mother stepped into the water carrying the boy, I saw her hesitate at the first chill. The boy whimpered in his sleep, shifting against her shoulder. I waded back to her and offered to carry him. She hesitated again, eyes darting to the muddy current, then gently passed him into my arms as though surrendering the last anchor she trusted. His small body was light but limp, and I cradled him close to keep his head above the water's spray. Step by step we crossed, the rope taut between us like a lifeline stitched through every hand that held it. The river pressed harder near the deepest point, tugging at our knees, but each man leaned into the current, bearing the weight together. When we reached the far bank, Diaz hauled me up by the elbow. The mother stumbled ashore behind us, clutching the rope until her knuckles were white. She dropped to her knees beside her child as I laid him down on a patch of dry grass. He stirred slightly, eyes fluttering open for the first time since we'd carried him from the flooded hut. A frail sound, half cough, half sigh, escaped him, but it was a sound of life. For a brief moment, the whole chain of us stood still on the bank, catching our breath, rainwater dripping from sleeves and hems into the soil. It wasn't a victory cheer that passed among us, just the quiet relief of men who had seen something fragile reach the other side intact. Heller crouched by the boy and said gruffly, "Let's get him moving to the clinic before the river changes its mind again." We packed quickly, cutting down a fallen branch to use as a stretcher pole. Diaz tied the blankets into a sling, and together we hoisted the boy onto it. As we began the trek down the valley trail, the mist began to thin and a pale sun filtered through the clouds. The river's distant roar softened behind us, replaced by the creak of boots in wet grass and the quiet breaths of the mother who kept close to my side. The walk back to our own side felt longer than the one that had brought us down the valley. Without the stretcher, our pace should have been faster, but the night's ordeal had left our legs heavy and our minds slower to shake off the weight of what we'd carried. We followed the same narrow trail along the river, now glinting silver under a thinning sky. Sunlight touched the mist in patches, turning it gold at the edges like torn silk. The forest that had loomed dark and wet during the night now smelled of wet earth and crushed leaves, fresh but somehow still tense, as though it hadn't decided whether the storm was truly over. Diaz kept a few paces ahead, his boots leaving deep prints in the damp soil. Every so often he'd reach up to adjust the strap of his pack, though it was barely weighted. I think the movement was more habit than need, something to do with his hands as we walked in silence. Behind me, Heller hummed an old marching tune under his breath, the notes low and steady. It wasn't a happy song, more of a rhythm to keep steps moving when the body wanted to stop. When we reached the shallow ford where we'd crossed earlier, the water had receded enough to show stones polished smooth by the current. We paused there, watching the water slide past our boots. No one spoke, but I knew we were all thinking of the boy, wondering if he was still breathing easily inside the clinic's walls. On the far side of the ford, a hawk lifted from a pine branch and circled low overhead before gliding toward the ridge. The sight of it somehow made the valley feel calmer, as if nature itself had granted us passage. We climbed the last rise toward our outpost, each step dragging through mud that clung to our soles. At the crest, the rooftops of camp came into view, tin sheets that caught the morning light in cold flashes. When we entered the perimeter, a few of the men working on supply crates looked up. Their eyes tracked the mud on our trousers and the empty stretcher poles we still carried. No questions were asked. Perhaps the story was already written on our faces. Captain Rains met us near the medic tent, his expression unreadable at first glance. His gaze lingered on my mud-caked boots before shifting to the streaks of river water on Heller's sleeves. "You made it back," he said flatly, then added, "I hear the boy's alive." I nodded. "He's in the clinic, still weak but alive." Rains's shoulders eased almost imperceptibly, and he gave a single nod in return. "Well, done," he said, then walked away without further comment, as if to give the moment its own silence. Diaz slumped onto an overturned crate near the tent and unstrapped his boots with a groan. Heller went straight to the water barrel to rinse the mud from his hands. letting the cold stream run over his wrists as though washing away more than dirt. I stood a little apart, watching the river glint in the distance where it wound through the valley, thinking about the fine line that had separated duty from mercy that night. There was no medal waiting for us, no official mention in the daily log, just the quiet knowledge that a life had been carried out of the dark. Later, when I lay in my cot trying to rest, the sound that lingered in my ears wasn't the river or the stretcher poles creaking. It was the boy's faint cough from the valley trail, and the way his mother's hand had never left his forehead. That image, more than the long night in the rain or the cold water against my thighs, stayed with me as proof that sometimes the smallest acts carry the heaviest weight. Years later, I still think about that boy whenever the rain starts and the river swells. Not because I kept him alive with any special skill, but because that night taught me how thin the line is between enemy and neighbor, between duty and mercy. After the field report was filed, there was no commendation, no entry in the official logs beyond a note that we'd been out on medical duty in rough weather. I doubt anyone who read it in headquarters could picture the valley or the rope-marked hands that hauled that stretcher up the slick trail. When my own son was born a few years later, I remember how tiny his head felt in my palm, and I thought of that woman cradling her boy by the riverside. I wondered if she ever knew our names or whether she even remembered our faces once the fever broke. In a way, it didn't matter. A stranger's gratitude isn't the reason a medic lifts a stretcher or keeps walking through water in the dark. You do it because you can, because the alternative is leaving someone behind. The years since then have made me slower on my feet and grayer at the temples, but that lesson has not dulled. Whenever I'm asked why I chose to stay in medicine after service, I tell them about that night. The river running high, the child's rattling breath, and the way the stretcher felt heavier with every step, even though the boy weighed almost nothing. There's another thing I learned then. Courage isn't always loud. It doesn't always come with shouting or gunfire. Sometimes it's as quiet as holding one corner of a stretcher while the rain beats down, saying nothing so you can save your breath for the climb. If you're listening to this and you've ever been in a moment where you had to help someone you were told not to help, I hope you did what your heart asked of you. It's not a story that makes it into medals or speeches, but it's the kind of choice that builds the person you carry with you for the rest of your life. I still remember the boy's cough softening by the time we reached the clinic, as if he too had sensed the weight lifting. That sound has stayed with me longer than the rumble of the storm or the squelch of mud under my boots. If there's one thought I would pass on to anyone hearing this tale, it's that sometimes the real victory is in carrying what you can carry, be it a wounded child, a regret, or a promise, until it reaches safer ground. So when the river rises in your own life and the night feels heavier than you think you can handle, remember that the steps forward still matter. One more step, then one more after that. Now tell me, have you ever had to carry something or someone you never expected to, only to realize later it changed the way you saw yourself? I'd like to hear about it in the comments. Stories like that deserve to be told even if they never make the papers.